The alarm in the council chamber went off before I even finished sitting down. My name is Ethan Cole, and I am the only human allowed inside the Galactic Council building. Not because I am important, because nobody else wanted the job. Earth was a small, forgotten planet to these people, and I was the small, forgotten man sent to represent it. I remember the exact moment everything changed. A tall alien with silver skin, a council speaker named Threll, tapped his data screen and read out a request. A fleet called the Kryvan Dominion wanted permission to take control of an unclaimed system. He said the system had one planet, with breathable air and simple life forms. He said the word simple like it was a compliment to no one. I felt my stomach drop before he even said the name. He said Sol. He said Earth. I stood up so fast that my chair scraped against the floor, and every alien in that chamber turned to look at me like I had committed a crime. I said that system was not unclaimed. I said 7 billion people lived there. I said Earth had cities, oceans, governments, laws, and history longer than most of their empires combined. Nobody cared. A council member with too many eyes waved a hand at me and said humans were not even registered as a tier species with voting rights. He said my planet was classified as low value and low risk, and that the Kryvan Dominion had already filed the correct paperwork. He said it like paperwork mattered more than a planet full of people. I looked around that chamber and realized something horrible. These were not evil people making an evil decision. They were bored people making a lazy decision. To them, Earth was a line on a form, a box to check, a resource to hand away to whichever empire asked first, and asked politely. I asked for a delay. I asked for someone, anyone, to send an official message to Earth before ships arrived. Threll told me that under council law, a species without full membership does not receive advance warning. He said it was not personal. He said the Kryvan Dominion had a long, clean record of efficient resource extraction, and that Earth's atmosphere and organic material had rated very high on their scanners. Efficient extraction. That was the phrase he used for my home. I asked what would happen to the people already living there. He looked at me the way you look at someone asking a question with an obvious answer. He said the standard procedure was pacification, followed by relocation of the biological population to secondary habitats, followed by full resource harvesting. Pacification, relocation, harvesting. 3 words. That was the entire plan for 8 billion lives. I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear exactly, something sharper. I had spent 3 years in this building, learning their languages, their customs, smiling politely while they patted my shoulder and called humans a curious little species. I had swallowed every insult because I believed that patience would eventually earn Earth a real seat at their table. In that moment, I stopped believing that. I asked Threll one more question. I asked if the Kryvan Dominion knew anything about the planet they were about to invade, beyond air quality and mineral content. He said, why would they need to know more than that? I did not answer him. I turned and walked straight out of the chamber, ignoring the 2 guards who moved to stop me, because for the first time since arriving at this council, I did not care what they thought of me. My communication rights on this station were limited. Officially, I could only send reports through council channels, which meant every word I wrote would be read, filtered, and delayed by aliens who did not think my planet was worth saving. I could not wait for official permission. I went to the small transmission room reserved for lower-tier observers, the room nobody bothered to guard because nobody thought a Tier 9 representative had anything worth stealing or sending. I sat down at the console, my hands shaking, and I typed a message meant for Earth's Global Defense Coordination Office, the only address I still remembered from training before I left home. I wrote that an armed fleet was heading toward Sol. I wrote that they believed Earth would be simple to pacify. I wrote that whatever Earth had prepared, it needed to be more than that, because I now understood something the Council did not. This was not a negotiation. This was not a diplomatic dispute that could be solved with patience and paperwork. This was an invasion, dressed up in polite Council language to make it sound clean. I hit send before anyone could stop me, then sat back and stared at the black screen, waiting for a response that might take hours to arrive across the distance between here and home. While I waited, I thought about how the Council saw us. To them, humans were a species that had only just discovered how to leave our own atmosphere. We had no standing fleet capable of interstellar travel. We had built stations on our moon and sent small probes past our own solar system, and by their measurements, that made us primitive. What they did not measure, because they never bothered to look, was history. They did not know that humans had spent our entire existence solving problems that should have destroyed us. Disease, disaster, each other. They did not know that when threatened, humans do not simply lie down. They adapt. They build. They find a way, even when the way does not exist yet. I did not know if that would matter against a fleet of warships. I did not know if courage and stubbornness could stand against advanced weapons and armor plating built for 100 different battlefields across the galaxy. But I knew one thing for certain. The Kryvan Dominion had scanned our air, our water, and our minerals. They had not scanned our will. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts. A reply had come through, garbled by distance and static, but readable. It was short. It said the message had been received, and that the appropriate departments were being alerted immediately. It said, "Thank you for the warning, Ethan." That was all. No details on what Earth could actually do to prepare. No promise of victory. Just a short, calm acknowledgement from a home that had no idea how outmatched it might be. I sat alone in that small room for a long time after that, staring at the closed console, feeling the weight of what I had just done. I had broken protocol. I had gone around the Council's rules to warn my own planet, and if anyone found out, I would likely be removed from my position, maybe worse. I did not regret it, not for 1 second. Outside the transmission room, the station carried on as if nothing important had happened. Aliens walked past in their long robes and strange uniforms, discussing trade routes and mining rights and diplomatic dinners, completely unaware that somewhere far away, a small blue planet was about to prove them all wrong about what simple actually meant. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked back toward the council chamber, because whatever happened next, I needed to be there to see it. The doors opened just as I reached them, and I heard Threll's voice already moving on to the next item on the agenda, as if Earth's fate had already been decided and forgotten in the same breath. I took my seat again, quiet this time, and I watched the Kryvan Dominion's fleet commander receive his final authorization on the giant display above the chamber floor. Ships numbered in the hundreds, weapons rated far beyond anything Earth had ever built. A timeline that predicted total pacification within a matter of days. I looked at that number, and I thought of every human being who had ever refused to give up when the odds said they should. I thought, they have no idea what they are about to meet. And somewhere far across the galaxy, right on schedule, the first Kryvan ship slipped out of hyperspace directly above Earth's sky, expecting silence and expecting surrender. They received neither. The first reports came in through Council channels less than a day later, and they were nothing like what the Kryvan Dominion had promised. I was sitting in my small quarters on the station, unable to sleep, when a notification lit up my screen. It was a routine military update meant for Council record-keeping, the kind of report nobody usually reads because invasions like this were supposed to be predictable and short. I opened it anyway, and my eyes went straight to the casualty numbers. They did not make sense. The Kryvan Dominion had sent an advance group of ships to establish orbit and begin what they called a soft pacification, using stun fields and disabling weapons meant to force a population into surrender without destroying valuable resources. Their own reports described the operation as routine. Their own reports also described something they clearly did not expect. Ground teams that had landed near a coastal city were unable to maintain control of the area. Their equipment, built for capturing frightened, unarmed populations, had been met with organized resistance within hours. Vehicles were disabled using improvised methods the Kryvan engineers could not immediately identify. Communication lines were cut. A supply depot meant to support their advanced troops had been taken over completely, its contents missing, its guards left unharmed but without their weapons. I read that last part 3 times. Left unharmed but without their weapons. I thought about what that meant. Humans did not need to remove every soldier sent against us. We only needed to make it impossible for them to continue their plan, and my people had found dozens of clever, careful ways to do exactly that within the very first hours of contact. The Kryvan commander overseeing the operation, a Dominion officer named Vex Caldron, submitted a report requesting additional forces. His written explanation to Council oversight was strange, almost embarrassed in tone. He wrote that Earth's population showed unusual levels of coordination for a species without a unified world government. He wrote that local resistance appeared to organize faster than his own forces could adapt. I sat back in my chair and let myself smile for the first time in days. Of course they organized fast. Humans had spent our entire history training for exactly this kind of moment, even without knowing an alien invasion was coming. Every emergency response system, every volunteer group, every quiet agreement between neighbors to help each other when something went wrong, all of it existed because humans understood something the Kryvan Dominion never bothered to study. Threats do not wait for permission. Neither do people who refuse to be treated as victims. Over the following days, the reports kept arriving, and each one made the Kryvan Dominion sound less like a conquering force and more like a group of confused invaders trying to understand a puzzle with pieces that kept changing shape. One report described an orbital platform the Kryvan had used to monitor troop movement across a continent. It had been disabled early in the invasion, a calculated strike meant to blind Earth's defenders from above. The very same report noted that within 6 hours, a similar platform, smaller and clearly built using scavenged materials, had reappeared in nearly the same orbital position, sending basic surveillance data back to ground forces. Vex Caldron's engineers could not explain how a species without a unified space program had managed to launch replacement hardware that quickly. They assumed it must have been a pre-built backup system. I knew better. I knew that somewhere on Earth, engineers with almost no advanced knowledge of alien technology had studied wreckage falling from their own sky and found a way to turn enemy debris into something useful within a matter of hours. I began keeping my own private notes, separate from anything the Council saw, because I wanted to understand the pattern forming in front of me. Every single report described the same basic shape of events. The Kryvan Dominion would deploy an advantage, expecting it to overwhelm a primitive population. Humans would absorb the initial shock, adapt within an impossibly short window, and respond with a solution nobody outside our species could have predicted. Their vehicles proved effective against open ground, until reports came in of narrow city streets swallowing entire columns of them, slowed and stopped by forces using the layout of towns built centuries before space travel was ever imagined. Their aircraft proved effective at watching from above, until pilots began reporting that certain regions had somehow developed working countermeasures against Kryvan scanning systems, hiding entire population centers from detection using methods their sensors labeled as primitive interference, unable to properly identify what was actually happening. I later learned that humans had simply studied the frequency patterns of Kryvan scanners after examining damaged equipment, and built basic countermeasure devices using parts taken from their own damaged cities. What the Kryvan engineers called primitive interference, my people called quick thinking. Back on the Council station, Threll and the other members began noticing the delay in what should have been a short, simple operation. During one session, a Council member from a heavily armored species asked Threll directly why the Kryvan Dominion had not yet reported full pacification of Earth, since their timeline had projected total control within days. Threll looked uncomfortable answering that question. He said the Dominion's forces were experiencing what he called unexpected variables in their operational efficiency. I almost laughed out loud in the middle of the chamber. Unexpected variables. That was the phrase they chose to describe 8 billion people refusing to give up their planet without a fight. I began to notice something else during those sessions. Council members who had never once looked in my direction before were now glancing at me with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand what kind of species could cause this much trouble for an empire they considered dangerous and capable. One evening, a council researcher named Sella approached me in the station's public hall, something no alien had bothered to do since I first arrived. She asked me quietly, almost like she did not want anyone else to hear, what humans were like. Not our biology or our resources. Our nature. I told her the truth. I told her that humans had spent our entire history dealing with disaster, hardship, and each other, and that somewhere along the way we had built an instinct for survival that did not depend on advanced technology or unified leadership. I told her that humans did not need permission to resist. We simply did it, individually and together, whenever something threatened what we cared about. She asked if that instinct would be enough against an empire like the Kryvan Dominion. I told her I did not know for certain, but that every single report coming out of Earth suggested the Dominion had badly underestimated exactly how far that instinct could carry us. Meanwhile, on Earth, the picture growing behind the official Kryvan reports was becoming impossible to hide. Coordination that had once been scattered across different regions began linking together with startling speed, sharing information about enemy weaknesses discovered in one place almost as fast as those weaknesses were found somewhere else. Ordinary volunteers worked alongside trained defenders, providing supplies, information, and support that the Kryvan Dominion had never planned for, because their models assumed only trained forces would resist. I learned later that a woman named Grace Whitfield, a senior commander overseeing part of Earth's coordinated defense, had become something of a central figure during those early days, organizing resistance efforts across multiple regions using systems built quickly out of necessity rather than years of preparation. I never met her personally, not during those first weeks, but her name began appearing again and again in intercepted reports the Kryvan Dominion filed with growing concern. Caldron's communications became more urgent as the days passed. He requested reinforcement fleets far larger than his original estimate. He requested updated intelligence on Earth's true capabilities, admitting in one particularly telling message that his initial assessment of the planet had been, in his own words, critically incomplete. Critically incomplete. That was the closest thing to an apology I ever saw from the Kryvan Dominion. The Council, for its part, began treating the Earth situation with a seriousness it had never shown before. What started as a routine resource acquisition now occupied significant portions of every session, with member after member demanding updates on why a Tier 9 species with no recognized space fleet had managed to turn a simple pacification into a prolonged, costly conflict. I sat through every one of those sessions with a strange, quiet feeling growing inside me. Not joy exactly, something closer to vindication, mixed with worry for the people back home who were fighting an enemy far more advanced than anything Earth had ever prepared for. During one late session, Threll finally turned to look directly at me, something he had avoided doing since the day I first raised my objection. He asked, in front of the entire chamber, why I had not warned the Council more clearly about what Earth was capable of. I told him the truth. I told him I had tried, and that nobody had listened, because they had already decided humans were simple before they ever bothered to learn anything about us. The chamber went quiet after that, not because they agreed with me, because for the first time they were beginning to understand that their own assumptions might have created this entire situation, and that the empire they had so casually authorized to take our planet was now struggling against something none of them fully understood. I looked around that quiet chamber and thought about Vex Cauldron, somewhere above Earth's sky, staring at reports that made no sense to him, commanding a fleet that had expected an easy victory and instead found itself trapped in a fight against a species that simply refused to stop. I thought, they still do not understand what they are truly facing. And far below, on a planet the Council had once dismissed as unimportant, humans were only just beginning to show the Kryvan Dominion exactly how wrong that dismissal had been. 10 days after the invasion began, the Council called an emergency session unlike anything I had seen since arriving at that station. Every member race was present, even the ones who rarely bothered attending routine meetings. The air in the chamber felt different, tighter somehow, as delegates whispered to each other while staring at a massive display showing updated casualty and resource reports from the Kryvan Dominion. I took my seat quietly, aware that every eye in that room would eventually turn toward me, and it did not take long before they did. Threll opened the session by stating plainly that the numbers coming out of Earth no longer matched any predictive model the Council had on file. He said the Kryvan Dominion had lost nearly a third of its deployed ground forces, along with a significant number of orbital assets, in an operation that was originally projected to require minimal losses. A delegate from a species covered in thick-plated scales stood up and asked, with clear frustration in his voice, how a Tier 9 species with no verified interstellar fleet could inflict that level of damage on an empire experienced in dozens of successful pacifications. Nobody answered him immediately, because nobody had an answer. Threll turned to me. He asked me directly, in front of the entire chamber, to explain what was happening on Earth. For a moment, I almost laughed. For years, this same chamber had ignored everything I tried to tell them about my home. Now, with their approved invasion falling apart in real time, they wanted my opinion. I stood up slowly, choosing my words with care, because I understood that whatever I said next would shape how every species in this room thought about humanity from that point forward. I told them that humans were not simple. I told them that our species had spent our entire history solving problems without waiting for permission or perfect conditions. I explained that Earth had no single government, no single military, no single leader giving orders to every human being at once, and that this apparent weakness was, in this exact situation, an enormous strength. There was no single command center to disable, no single leader to remove, in order to end resistance. Humanity was not one large machine that could be shut down with a single well-placed strike. We were millions of smaller systems, all capable of thinking, adapting, and acting independently, all working toward the same basic goal of protecting our home. A delegate asked why Earth's military had been able to coordinate so quickly across such a fractured population if there was truly no single command structure guiding them. I explained that humans had spent centuries building networks of cooperation long before any alien ship arrived in our sky. Trade routes, communication systems, emergency response networks built to handle disasters that had nothing to do with war. When the invasion began, those same systems, built originally for entirely different purposes, were repurposed almost overnight into something capable of coordinating a defense. I told them about Grace Whitfield, the commander whose name had appeared so often in Kryvan reports. I explained that she had not been given authority by some grand galactic ranking system. She had simply been trusted by the people around her because of years spent earning that trust through consistent, careful leadership. That kind of authority, built on relationships rather than rank, was something the Kryvan Dominion had never learned to fight against, because it did not follow any pattern their strategic models recognized. The chamber remained silent as I spoke, and for the first time, I felt like they were actually listening rather than tolerating me. I continued, explaining something I had come to understand clearly after days of studying every report available to me. Humans possessed something that could not easily be measured by scanners or resource assessments. Call it determination, or resilience, or simply refusal. Whatever name you gave it, the pattern was the same throughout every single report coming out of Earth. When faced with a threat that should have overwhelmed us completely, my species consistently chose to keep fighting rather than accept defeat, even when the odds against us seemed impossible. A delegate from a smaller, quieter species asked whether that determination came from some kind of biological enhancement, or perhaps advanced training programs unknown to the Council. I told her the truth, because there was no point hiding it any longer. Humans had no special biological advantage, no secret training program. What we had was history, thousands of years of surviving disasters, disagreements, and dangers that could have ended our species entirely, and somehow finding a way through every single time. That history had shaped something deep in how humans approached any threat, whether it came from within our own world or from beyond it. Threll asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. He asked if I believed Earth could actually win this conflict against a fully mobilized Kryvan Dominion fleet. I paused before answering, because I did not want to promise something I could not guarantee. I told him honestly that I did not know for certain, but that every single piece of evidence gathered so far suggested the Kryvan Dominion had severely underestimated exactly what kind of opponent they had chosen to invade. I told him that humans did not fight like an empire, following a rigid strategy. We fought like a species defending its only home, and that difference mattered more than any weapon or ship count. The Council began pulling up archive data at that point, records that had apparently existed for years but had never been seriously reviewed because nobody considered Earth important enough to study. Historical summaries flashed across the massive display, showing brief, condensed versions of human history that even I found strange to see reduced to simple bullet points and timelines. Wars fought across centuries, empires that rose and fell, diseases that wiped out large portions of our population, followed by recovery and continued growth. Discoveries made not by unified global effort, but by countless individuals working in isolation, each one contributing small pieces toward larger breakthroughs that eventually changed everything. Several delegates who had clearly never bothered reading any of this before sat in visible shock as the summaries continued. I watched their expressions shift from mild curiosity to something closer to genuine unease, as if they were only now beginning to understand what kind of species they had so casually allowed the Kryvan Dominion to invade. One delegate asked quietly why, if humans were truly this capable, Earth had never developed the kind of advanced technology commonly seen throughout the rest of the galaxy. I told her that capability and opportunity were two very different things. Humans had never encountered another intelligent species before this invasion. We had never needed advanced weapons or defensive fleets, because until recently, we had no reason to believe threats like this existed. Our technology reflected our history, not our potential. Given a real reason to advance quickly, humans had already shown, in just 10 days, how fast that could change. Threll sat quietly for a long moment after I finished speaking, staring at the display still showing fragments of human history. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded different than it had during any previous session, less confident, almost cautious. He said the Council would need to reconsider its classification of Earth immediately, given the clear gap between the Kryvan Dominion's original assessment and the reality now unfolding across the planet. I felt something settle in my chest as he said those words. Not quite relief, because the fighting was still happening far below, with real people facing real danger every single day, but something close to it. For the first time since I had arrived at this station, the Council was finally looking at my home the way it deserved to be seen. As the session continued, updated reports from the front lines began arriving in real time, displayed for the entire chamber to see, rather than filtered through official summaries first. I watched delegates react with visible surprise as footage showed human forces not simply defending their positions, but beginning to push forward, reclaiming territory the Kryvan Dominion had initially secured. One particular report caught everyone's attention. A group of Kryvan soldiers, cut off from their main force after a failed advance, had reportedly been surrounded not by superior firepower, but by careful strategy and patience, forced to surrender their equipment without a single shot being fired in the final exchange. A delegate asked how that was possible, given the technological gap between the two forces. I told her something I had come to understand deeply over these past 10 days. Technology alone did not decide the outcome of every conflict. Understanding your opponent, adapting faster than they expected, and refusing to give up even when circumstances looked impossible, those things mattered just as much, sometimes more. The Kryvan Dominion had scanned our planet for resources and atmosphere composition. They had never bothered to scan for the one thing that would ultimately decide the outcome of this invasion: our will to protect what was ours. As the emergency session finally came to a close, Threll turned to me one final time before dismissing the chamber. He asked if there was anything else the Council needed to understand about Earth before deciding how to proceed. I told him one last thing, something I had been thinking about since the very first day this invasion was authorized without a second thought. I told him that humans had spent our entire history being underestimated by anyone who never bothered to truly understand us, and that every single time, that mistake had cost our opponents far more than they ever expected to lose. The chamber remained silent as I sat back down, and for the first time since arriving on this station years ago, I felt every single delegate in that room looking at me, and at Earth, with something the Council had never given us before. Genuine respect. 3 weeks after the invasion began, everything changed direction, and I watched it happen from the strange, distant safety of the Council station, feeling every update land like a small shockwave through my chest. The reports arriving now were no longer about Earth defending its cities or slowing down Kryvan advances. They described something entirely different. Human forces were moving beyond their own borders, pushing into territory the Kryvan Dominion had used as staging points during the early days of the invasion, and doing it with a speed that left Council analysts struggling to update their projections fast enough. I remember reading one particular report twice, just to make sure I understood it correctly. A group of human engineers, working alongside soldiers near a coastal region, had managed to recover a damaged Kryvan transport ship, one abandoned during a failed retreat. Within days, that same ship had been repaired, using a mixture of scavenged Kryvan parts and human manufacturing techniques, and was reportedly operational enough to conduct short-range reconnaissance missions. I sat back in my chair, stunned, thinking about what that meant. Humans were no longer simply defending against alien technology. We were beginning to understand it, adapt it, and use it against the very empire that brought it here. Vex Caldron's communications, which I still had limited access to through Council oversight channels, had shifted noticeably in tone over those 3 weeks. Early messages had been confident, almost dismissive of Earth's resistance. Later messages carried a different weight entirely, filled with requests for reinforcement, updated intelligence, and permission to adjust strategy in ways that suggested his original plan had completely fallen apart. One message in particular stayed with me. Caldron wrote that Earth's forces had begun demonstrating what he called adaptive warfare patterns unlike anything documented in previous Dominion campaigns. He noted that human commanders seemed to learn from every single encounter, adjusting tactics within hours rather than the weeks or months typically required by other species the Dominion had previously encountered. I thought about Grace Whitfield again, wondering how much of that adaptive strategy came from leaders like her, coordinating information across regions faster than the Kryvan Dominion could track. I imagined command centers scattered across the planet, sharing lessons learned from one battle to prepare for the next, building a growing library of knowledge about their enemy that the Kryvan Dominion simply could not match, because their own command structure relied on rigid, top-down decision-making that took far too long to adjust. During one council session, a delegate asked Threll directly whether the Kryvan Dominion intended to request a formal ceasefire, given the deteriorating situation described in recent reports. Threll hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. He said the Dominion had not formally requested council mediation, but that unofficial communications suggested their command was exploring options for what he carefully called a strategic withdrawal. A strategic withdrawal, not a ceasefire, not a peace agreement. A quiet retreat, dressed up in careful language, meant to protect what remained of the Dominion's reputation among the other council members. I understood immediately what that meant. The Kryvan Dominion was not trying to end this conflict peacefully. They were trying to disappear from it as quietly as possible, before the full extent of their failure became impossible to hide from the rest of the galaxy. Over the following days, that suspicion proved correct. Reports showed Kryvan ships pulling back from several key positions across Earth, consolidating their remaining forces into smaller, more defensible areas rather than continuing their original campaign of full planetary pacification. Their public statements to the Council became vague, focusing on temporary tactical adjustments rather than acknowledging any kind of meaningful defeat. Meanwhile, human forces continued advancing, not recklessly, but with the same careful, coordinated patience that had defined their defense from the very beginning. I read reports of supply lines being cut off, forcing isolated Kryvan units to surrender their equipment simply because they had no way to continue their operations. I read about human negotiators, ordinary people trained quickly for an extraordinary situation, successfully convincing entire groups of Kryvan soldiers to stand down without further conflict, using patience and clear communication rather than overwhelming force. One report described a coordinated effort near a mountainous region where human forces successfully reclaimed an entire Kryvan staging base, recovering valuable equipment and technology that would later prove useful in understanding how the Dominion's systems worked. The report noted, almost as an afterthought, that the operation had been planned and executed by a mixed team of military personnel and civilian volunteers working together under the guidance of a young captain named Nathan Price, someone who had apparently gained a reputation among his fellow defenders for calm, careful leadership under pressure. I did not know Nathan Price personally, but reading about people like him and Grace Whitfield, ordinary humans rising to meet an extraordinary threat, filled me with a kind of quiet pride I had never expected to feel while sitting in a council chamber built by species who once dismissed my entire planet as unimportant. During one particularly tense session, Threll received an updated communication directly from Caldron, and for the first time, he read it aloud to the entire chamber, rather than summarizing it privately. Caldron's message admitted, in careful but unmistakable language, that the Kryvan Dominion's original assessment of Earth had been fundamentally flawed. He wrote that continuing the current operation would require resources far beyond what the Dominion was willing to commit, given the unexpected resilience and adaptability demonstrated by the planet's population. He formally requested Council acknowledgement that the Dominion intended to withdraw remaining forces from the Sol system entirely. The chamber erupted into quiet, urgent conversation the moment Threll finished reading. Delegates from other species began asking pointed questions, not about Earth this time, but about the Kryvan Dominion itself. If an empire with the Dominion's reputation and resources could be forced into a full withdrawal by a Tier 9 species with no recognized interstellar fleet, what did that say about the accuracy of the Council's entire classification system? I sat quietly through most of that conversation, watching decades of assumptions about species like Earth begin to crumble in real time. For years, the Council had organized the galaxy according to neat, predictable categories, deciding which species deserved protection, representation, and respect based on measurements of technology and military strength. Earth had just proven, in less than a month, that those measurements missed something essential. A delegate finally turned to me and asked what I believed should happen next, now that the Kryvan Dominion appeared ready to abandon their invasion entirely. I told her honestly that the decision was not really the Council's to make anymore. Earth had defended itself without meaningful Council assistance, using its own resources, its own strategies, and its own people. Any conversation about what happened next needed to include actual representatives from Earth, chosen by Earth, rather than decisions made about us without us, which was exactly the mistake that had led to this entire situation in the first place. Threll looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly, something I had never seen him do in response to anything I said before. Over the following days, the Kryvan Dominion's withdrawal became official, though quiet, as if they hoped the entire situation might simply be forgotten by the rest of the galaxy if they moved quickly and stayed silent about the details. Ships that had once filled Earth's orbital space began retreating, first in small groups, then in larger formations, until reports confirmed that the last significant Kryvan presence had left the Sol system entirely. I remember the exact moment I read that final confirmation. I was sitting alone in my quarters, the same small room I had used to send that desperate first warning weeks earlier, and I felt something in my chest finally loosen, like a held breath finally released after far too long. Earth had survived. Not through Council protection, not through diplomatic intervention, through the simple, stubborn refusal of ordinary people to accept defeat, even against an enemy that should have overwhelmed us completely by every measurement the galaxy used to judge these things. The Council session that followed felt different from anything I had experienced during my years on that station. Delegates who once ignored me now waited for my opinion before making decisions. Threll opened the meeting by formally acknowledging that the Kryvan Dominion's actions against Earth had been authorized based on critically incomplete information, a careful way of admitting the Council itself bore responsibility for allowing this invasion to happen in the first place. A proposal was raised, discussed cautiously, suggesting that Earth's classification needed complete reevaluation, given everything that had happened. Several delegates argued for immediate promotion to full-tier status, while others urged caution, suggesting a more gradual approach, given how quickly this entire situation had already exceeded every expectation the Council held about our species. I listened to that debate with a strange sense of detachment, because I understood something those delegates were only beginning to grasp. Earth's value was never something the Council could properly measure using their existing systems. We were not simply moving up a ranking, we were forcing an entire galaxy to reconsider what those rankings actually meant. As the session continued, updated reports confirmed the full scope of what Earth had accomplished. Recovered Kryvan technology was already being studied by human scientists, eager to understand and improve upon what they had captured. Damaged regions were beginning slow, careful rebuilding efforts, supported by the same networks of cooperation that had carried humanity through the invasion itself. And perhaps most importantly, Earth's leadership, still scattered across different regions and governments, had begun coordinating a unified response to the Council for the very first time in human history, driven by the shared experience of surviving something that should have destroyed us. I thought about Grace Whitfield, Nathan Price, and countless other names I would likely never fully know, ordinary people who had faced an impossible situation and simply refused to accept the outcome the galaxy expected of them. Their courage, multiplied across millions of similar choices made by people across the entire planet, had accomplished something no amount of advanced technology could have guaranteed on its own. They had shown an entire galaxy exactly what happens when you underestimate a species built on resilience, cooperation, and the simple refusal to give up, even when every reasonable measurement suggested we should. As the session finally came to a close, Threll turned to address the chamber one last time before dismissing everyone for the evening. He said the Council would need time to properly reconsider its approach, not just to Earth, but to how it evaluated every species going forward, given how badly this situation had exposed the flaws in their existing system. I sat quietly, watching delegates file out of the chamber, each one glancing toward me with an expression I had never seen directed at humanity before this invasion began. Not curiosity, not dismissal, caution, mixed with something that looked remarkably like respect. 2 months after the last Kryvan ship left the Sol system, I stood in the same council chamber that had once laughed me out of the room, and I felt the entire weight of that memory settle quietly in my chest as I waited for the session to begin. The chamber looked the same as it always had. Same curved walls, same soft lighting designed for a dozen different alien eyes, same massive display hovering above the central floor. But everything else about that room had changed, and I could feel it in the way delegates greeted me when I arrived, nodding politely instead of ignoring me the way they once had. Threll called the session to order, and the first item on the agenda was Earth. It always was now. He explained that the Council's formal review of Earth's classification had finally concluded, after weeks of careful study involving representatives from multiple species, all trying to understand exactly what had happened during those first chaotic weeks of invasion and resistance. He said the review committee had struggled to place Earth within any existing category, because our species did not fit neatly into the measurements the Council had relied upon for centuries. He announced that Earth would be reclassified, not into an existing tier, but into a newly created category, reserved for species whose true capabilities could not be accurately measured using standard methods. The Council was calling it an anomaly classification, a careful, cautious way of admitting they simply did not know what to make of us yet. I almost smiled at the term, anomaly. After years of being dismissed as simple, humanity had somehow become too complicated and unpredictable to categorize properly. I thought that was, in its own strange way, exactly the kind of recognition Earth deserved. Threll continued, explaining that this new classification came with certain provisions. Earth would receive limited representation rights within the Council, along with protections against unauthorized resource claims like the one that had led to this entire invasion in the first place. It was not full membership. It was not equal standing with the oldest, most established empires in the galaxy, but it was something Earth had never had before. Recognition, real recognition, that we existed as a species worth understanding rather than simply exploiting. I stood to speak on behalf of Earth, something I had done many times before, but this time felt different. This time, every single delegate in that chamber listened carefully to every word, rather than waiting politely for me to finish so they could move on to matters they considered more important. I told them that Earth accepted this new classification, understanding it as a starting point rather than a final destination. I told them that humanity had spent our entire existence being underestimated, and that we had grown accustomed to proving ourselves through actions rather than words. I said that we did not need the galaxy's approval to know our own worth, but that we welcomed the opportunity to build honest relationships with species willing to actually understand us, rather than simply measure us. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber as I spoke, and I noticed something I had never seen before in all my years on that station. Genuine attention, genuine curiosity, delegates leaning forward slightly, as if trying to understand something about humanity that their instruments and reports could never fully capture. After the session, several delegates approached me directly, something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. A representative from a species known for cautious, careful diplomacy asked quietly whether Earth might consider establishing formal communication channels for potential trade discussions in the future. Another delegate, from a smaller, quieter species that had rarely spoken to me before, asked simple, genuine questions about human culture, clearly curious rather than dismissive for the first time since I had known her. Even Sela, the researcher who had first approached me during the darkest days of the invasion, found me afterward with a different kind of question. She asked if Earth might be willing to share some of its historical records more openly, now that the Council understood how much they had missed by never bothering to study us properly before. I told her I would relay the request, though I suspected Earth's leadership would need time to decide exactly how open they wanted to be, with a galaxy that had so recently authorized our own invasion without a second thought. Word of what had happened at Earth spread quickly across other systems in the following weeks, carried through Council channels and independent trade networks alike. I began receiving quiet, informal messages from representatives of species Earth had never even known existed before this invasion, some offering cautious congratulations, others asking careful, curious questions about what exactly had allowed a Tier 9 species to force a full withdrawal from an empire as established as the Crevan Dominion. I answered each message honestly, though carefully, aware that Earth's reputation across the galaxy was still being shaped by how we chose to represent ourselves during this delicate period. I explained, again and again, that humanity's strength had never come from advanced technology or overwhelming military force. It came from something simpler, and in some ways far more powerful: the refusal to accept defeat, combined with an instinct for cooperation that allowed millions of individual humans to work toward the same goal without requiring a single leader to command every decision. Back on Earth, life slowly began settling into a strange new normal. Damaged regions continued their rebuilding efforts, supported by international cooperation that had, ironically, grown stronger because of the invasion rather than weaker. Governments that had rarely worked closely together before found themselves sharing resources, knowledge, and strategies discovered during the conflict, building relationships that would likely outlast the crisis that created them. I learned that Grace Whitfield had been asked to help establish a new Coordinated Defense Council, a permanent version of the emergency systems that had formed so quickly during the invasion, designed to ensure Earth would never again face a threat unprepared. Nathan Price, along with countless other quiet heroes whose names I would likely never fully know, returned to rebuilding their communities, carrying forward lessons learned during those chaotic weeks into a more prepared, more united version of the world we had known before. During one of my final sessions before returning home for a scheduled visit, Threll asked me a question that surprised me, given everything that had happened between us over the years. He asked if I believed the Kryvan Dominion, or any other empire, might attempt something similar against Earth again in the future, now that our reputation across the galaxy had changed so dramatically. I told him honestly that I did not know for certain, but that I believed any species considering such an action would think far more carefully after witnessing what had happened during this invasion. Earth was no longer an unknown, unprotected planet waiting to be claimed by whichever empire filed the correct paperwork first. We were a species that had proven, clearly and completely, that underestimating us came with serious consequences. Threll nodded slowly, something that had become almost familiar between us by this point, and admitted quietly that the Council itself had learned an important lesson from this entire situation. Measurements of technology and military strength, while useful in many cases, could never fully capture the true nature of any species, especially one as complex and resilient as humanity had proven to be. I left that session and walked slowly through the station's public corridors, passing delegates from a dozen different species, each one offering a polite nod or brief greeting as I passed, a small gesture that would have seemed impossible when I first arrived at this posting. Standing near the observation window that evening, looking out at the vast, quiet stretch of space beyond the station, I thought about everything that had happened since that first alarm sounded in the council chamber weeks earlier. I thought about Grace Whitfield, Nathan Price, and millions of other ordinary people who had faced an impossible threat and simply refused to give up, proving something to an entire galaxy that no report or scanner could ever properly measure. Earth was no longer simple, no longer primitive, no longer a line item on some distant council form, waiting to be claimed by whichever empire asked first. We were something new to this galaxy, something they were still trying to understand, still trying to categorize, still watching carefully from a cautious distance. And as I stood there, looking out at that endless field of stars, I realized something important. Humanity did not need the galaxy's approval to know exactly who we were. We had already shown them. The Kryvan Dominion came expecting simple resources and an easy victory. What they found instead was a species that refused to be anything less than exactly what we had always been: resilient, determined, impossible to underestimate twice. And somewhere out among those distant stars, I suspected, other species were quietly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the small, stubborn planet called Earth, wondering nervously what might happen if they ever made the same mistake the Kryvan Dominion had made. I smiled quietly to myself, turned away from the window, and walked back toward my quarters, ready for whatever conversation the galaxy wanted to have with us next. Because for the first time since I arrived on this station, I was no longer worried about how they saw us. I was simply curious to see what humanity would do next.